Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Glad to be here for this one. It's a really intense topic.
It is. So, to start us off, I want you to imagine, just for a second, being the sole heir to a staggering fortune. You are a literal billionaire.
Okay, I can try to imagine that.
Right. You have absolute, total financial freedom. But instead of actually living in that reality, every single morning you wake up before dawn, you put on this scratchy uniform, and you go work a grueling 80-hour week at some minimum wage job.
Where your boss just screams at you all day.
Exactly. You'd think a person living that way had completely lost their mind. I mean, you'd probably want to shake them and be like, what are you doing? You do not have to live like this anymore.
It's such a baffling scenario to even picture. Yet, well, when we look at the source material we are diving into today, that is precisely the psychological and really the spiritual dynamic we are confronting here.
It really is.
We are looking at human beings who have been handed absolute freedom, yet they are actively clamoring to get back into their chains.
It is such a strange facet of human nature, and we're going to explore it today through a document that was essentially written to shake an entire community awake. We're diving into this fiery, really passionate letter written by the Apostle Paul, the biblical book of Galatians.
Yeah, and the stakes in this text are incredibly high.
They really are. We are looking at a community standing right on the brink of spiritual self-sabotage, and Paul is trying to pull them back. So our mission today is to explore this text as a manifesto on human freedom.
Calling it a manifesto really captures the sheer urgency of the text, I think. For our deep dive, we are examining the 6 chapters of Galatians, alongside some historical and theological commentaries from researchers like Albert Barnes and Matthew Henry.
Which are super helpful for the context.
Absolutely. And what these sources reveal is a massive paradigm shift. Paul is documenting the transition from a rigid, performance-based religious system, what the text calls the law, to a system based entirely on grace and faith in Christ.
Right. It's a total flip.
It forces us to look at the fundamental difference between trying to earn your worth and, simply receiving your worth.
That tension, that pull between earning and receiving is basically the pulse of the whole letter.
It really is.
To understand the explosive nature of how Paul opens this document, we have to look at the immediate crisis. This community in Galatia is abandoning their newfound freedom, almost overnight.
Yeah, so fast.
And Paul doesn't open with these standard, polite, ancient greetings. He doesn't say, oh, grace and peace, how's the weather? He opens with absolute, unvarnished bewilderment.
He's basically saying, what on earth are you doing?
Right. He says he is astonished that they are so quickly deserting the grace of Christ for a different gospel.
And the historical context here is critical to understanding his shock because, Paul had personally spent time in the region of Galatia. He had preached this gospel of grace, this message that they entirely accepted by God based on what Christ had done, not on their own religious performance.
And they loved it, right?
They did. The Galatians embraced it. They experienced this profound liberation. But shortly after Paul moved on to establish other communities, a new group of teachers arrived.
The troublemakers.
Exactly. These were conservative individuals, often referred to by historians as the Judaizers.
I want to break down who these Judaizers were because understanding their pitch, I think, helps explain why it was so incredibly seductive to the Galatians.
It was very seductive.
Because they weren't coming in and telling the Galatians to abandon God. They weren't like, hey, let's go worship some other deity. They were offering something much more subtle.
They were offering a checklist.
Yeah.
The Judaizers insisted that, sure, believing in Christ was a good start, but for these Gentile converts to truly belong to God's family, they had to adopt the Jewish ceremonial law.
Meaning they had to do stuff.
Exactly. They insisted the men had to be circumcised, they had to observe strict dietary purity laws, and they had to keep the traditional Jewish festivals.
Wow.
They were basically taking the message of unearned grace and bolting a checklist of human performance right onto it.
Which, honestly, is such an intoxicating pitch for the human ego. We love a checklist. If we translate this into our modern world, we live in an era of absolute information overload and constantly shifting loyalties.
Oh, for sure.
But the one thing that remains constant is our love for measurable self-improvement. We are obsessed with self-help trends that promise us control through behavior modification.
It gives us a sense of power.
Right. We want someone to tell us, hey, wake up at 5 a.m., take an ice bath, drink this green juice, meditate for 20 minutes, and then you will be optimal.
Right. Then you've made it.
Then you will be worthy. And the Judaizers were offering a measurable religion. Just do these physical things, and you will be justified. It makes you feel like you are the one in the driver's seat.
Which is the problem, because grace, by its very nature, demands that you relinquish the driver's seat.
Yeah.
It requires this deeply humbling admission that your performance, no matter how disciplined you are, cannot save you or earn you ultimate worth.
That's a hard pill to swallow.
It is. So when Paul looks back at Galatia and sees them trading the radical, kind of unmanageable freedom of grace for the illusion of control through religious checklists, he is horrified.
He's watching them put the chains back on.
Exactly. But to understand the ferocity of his protective instinct here, we have to look at Paul's own biography, which the commentaries we researched highlight so effectively.
Right, because before he was Paul the Apostle writing these letters of grace, he was Saul of Tarsus.
Yes.
And he wasn't just a casual follower of the rules, he was the ultimate enforcer. The text says he was a zealous Pharisee and a violent persecutor of the early church.
The term Pharisee is often thrown around loosely today. But back in the first century Greco-Roman world, the Pharisees were the cultural and religious elite.
They were the top tier.
Exactly. They believed that strict adherence to the law of Moses was the only way to preserve their national identity and purity against, the polluting influence of the Roman Empire.
So they took it incredibly seriously.
Very. And Paul was educated in the strictest sect of this tradition. The researchers note that Paul was advancing far beyond his peers. He was a man who believed, with terrifying conviction, that human performance, rule-keeping, and physically destroying the enemies of the law was the ultimate path to righteousness.
Let me test an analogy here just to capture the sheer whiplash of his transformation.
Go for it.
It's as if a ruthless corporate raider, someone whose entire worldview, status, and wealth are built on acquiring companies, liquidating their assets, and just worshiping the bottom line, has this sudden awakening and becomes the world's most passionate anti-capitalist whistleblower.
That's a huge shift.
Right. If a guy like that suddenly starts giving away his money and telling people that the corporate ladder is a death trap, you'd assume he had suffered a psychological break.
You would. People would think he was crazy.
Unless, of course, he saw something behind the curtain that fundamentally shattered reality as he knew it.
And building on that analogy, Paul isn't just whistleblowing. He is tearing down the very institution he once violently defended.
Wow.
And his argument to the Galatians is that this transformation could not possibly have come from human persuasion. I mean, if it were up to his elite education, his peer group, or his natural ambitions, he would have remained a celebrated Pharisee.
He was winning the game. Why would he quit?
Exactly. His entire argument in this opening section is that his message didn't come from human beings, nor was he taught it by human tradition. It came directly by divine revelation on the road to Damascus.
That establishes a really crucial foundational truth for this deep dive. True transformation comes from divine revelation, not human tradition.
Right.
Because his message is sourced directly from God, it is immutable. It cannot be altered, tweaked, or, upgraded by the shifting opinions of the crowd or the plausible founding arguments of these new teachers.
Which actually brings us to a significant obstacle for modern readers. Because Paul is so convinced of the divine origin of this grace, his language becomes incredibly intense.
Oh, yeah. He does not hold back.
He doesn't. He writes, "Even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed." And the Greek word he uses there is anathema.
Anathema. I know a lot of people read that and just completely recoil.
Oh, absolutely.
Modern culture is deeply uncomfortable with absolute exclusionary truth claims. Hearing someone say, "my way is the only way," and anyone who says otherwise is a curse, that sounds harsh, intolerant, and dogmatic to us.
It does.
We prefer spiritual blending, like the idea that all paths are basically valid.
It absolutely grates against modern sensibilities. But the commentary provides essential clarity here. This harshness isn't born out of petty theological gatekeeping. It reflects Paul's absolute conviction that the stakes are literal life and death.
Because of what's being lost.
Exactly. To add any human performance requirement to grace doesn't just tweak the system, it dismantles the entire mechanism of salvation.
Right.
If you mix grace and works, you no longer have grace. You have a wage system. The historical research points out that Paul is anathematizing the doctrine that destroys the grace of Christ, because any other path is a dead end that leads humanity right back into bondage.
I see. So it is a protective anger.
Yes.
Think about a parent screaming at a child who is wandering into a busy intersection. The parent isn't screaming because they are an angry, intolerant person who hates the child. They are screaming because they hate the oncoming traffic.
That's a perfect way to put it.
They know what will happen if the child takes another step. Paul is screaming to get them out of traffic. And he asks a piercing diagnostic question in the middle of all this. He says, "Am I now seeking the approval of man or of God?"
And that question cuts to the core of why the Galatians were backsliding in the first place. The Judaizers represented the respectable, established religious culture. Siding with them offered social approval.
It made them look good to the VIPs.
Exactly. Paul is challenging the listener to examine their deepest motivations.
Which offers a profound practical reflection for anyone listening to us today. Where in your life are you easily swayed by the next new thing or the opinions of a dominant crowd? Whose approval are you actually chasing?
That's a tough question.
It is. Are you willing to compromise your core convictions just to look respectable to a certain peer group?
Because if the desire for human approval remains unchecked, you will inevitably rebuild the very systems of bondage you were meant to be free from. And we actually see that play out vividly in a dramatic confrontation that Paul recounts next. The desire for social approval can compromise even the most elite leaders in a movement.
Okay, this might be one of the most shocking moments of early church history. We are talking about the ultimate historical example of call-out culture, and it centers on the hypocrisy of leadership.
It really does.
Paul has just established his authority, and now he proves that the message of grace is so vital, it requires holding the top brass accountable when they cave to peer pressure. The target of his rebuke is none other than the Apostle Peter.
Which is huge. The situation unfolds in the city of Antioch, which was this massive cosmopolitan hub and a major center for early Gentile Christianity.
It was very mixed.
Very mixed. And the core theological mechanism Paul is defending here is that justification, meaning the legal declaration by God that a person is righteous, is achieved by faith alone, not by works of the law.
Right.
Paul states clearly that if human effort could achieve this justification, then Christ died for nothing. It makes the crucifixion redundant.
To really feel the weight of this Antioch incident, we have to understand why eating together was such an explosive issue in the first century Mediterranean world. Because to us, this just sounds like sharing a plate of hummus, right?
Right. It doesn't sound like a big deal. But table fellowship in the ancient world was a profound statement of shared status and identity.
It meant you were equals.
Yes.
Right.
For a strict Jewish person, associating with or eating a meal with uncircumcised Gentiles was fundamentally forbidden. The dietary laws keeping kosher were designed to enforce separation and maintain ritual purity.
So to eat with a Gentile was to incur defilement.
Exactly. But Peter had previously received this massive paradigm-shifting revelation documented in the book of Acts, that in Christ, those purity barriers were obliterated.
The vision of the sheet with all the animals.
Right. So Peter goes to Antioch, and he is fully living in this new freedom. He is eating with the Gentile Christians, enjoying table fellowship, and completely ignoring the old dietary boundaries.
He is modeling the new reality. He's showing everyone that the ground is level. But then the dynamics shift.
Because some conservative Jewish Christians arrive from Jerusalem. They are sent from James, another major pillar of the early church. And these men still hold tightly to the Jewish customs and the separation laws.
Oh, so the pressure enters the room. The in-group has arrived.
The moment they arrive, Peter panics.
Really? Peter, the rock?
Yes. Out of fear of their judgment, fear of what the conservative elites will think of him, he gradually withdraws and separates himself from the Gentiles. He stops eating with them.
He just leaves them at the table.
He starts acting as if the old dietary laws and separations are still binding. And because Peter is a colossal figure of authority, his hypocrisy creates a massive ripple effect.
I bet.
The other Jewish Christians see Peter withdraw, and they follow his lead. Even Barnabas, who was Paul's trusted companion in preaching grace, is swept up in the tide of this social pressure.
The social dynamics are so painfully relatable here. It makes me think of a modern corporate scenario.
How so?
Well, imagine the CEO of a company who has spent months happily sitting in the cafeteria with the mailroom clerks, the interns, and the entry-level staff. He's actively building a beautiful egalitarian culture where rank just doesn't matter.
Sounds like a great boss.
Right. But then, the moment the wealthy conservative board of directors walks into the cafeteria for a site visit, the CEO suddenly stands up, straightens his tie, pretends he doesn't know the interns, and hurries over to a private VIP table.
Wow. Yeah, that would be devastating.
It is deeply hurtful to the interns, and it completely invalidates the egalitarian culture he claimed to champion.
It creates a two-tiered system immediately. Peter's withdrawal was communicating to the Gentiles without using a single word that they were second-class citizens.
That's awful.
It was implying that faith in Christ wasn't enough, that to sit at the adult table they needed to adopt Jewish customs. He was rebuilding the wall of hostility that Christ had torn down.
So Paul steps in, and he doesn't handle this quietly. He writes that he withstood Peter to his face before them all.
He did it in public.
Right. I can imagine reading this and wondering why Paul had to be so aggressive. I mean, why call him out publicly in front of the whole church? Why not pull Peter aside in a hallway, away from the crowds, and have a quiet, diplomatic chat?
It's a great question, and the commentaries provide excellent insight into the discernment required in leadership here. They make a sharp distinction between public and private reproof.
Okay, what's the difference?
If Peter's failure had been a private, individual moral lapse, a private confrontation would have been the loving and appropriate response. But Peter's actions were public, and they were theological.
Oh, because he was influencing everyone else.
Exactly. He was a leader actively leading the whole community astray into a false gospel. To protect the integrity of the truth, and more importantly, to defend the marginalized Gentiles who were being treated as second-class citizens, the rebuke had to be as public as the offense.
That makes total sense. If Paul stays silent to protect Peter's feelings, the gospel of grace basically dies in Antioch, replaced by a gospel of cultural conformity.
It would have been lost.
Translating this to our lives, it is a haunting mirror. We are constantly tempted to rebuild the walls we previously dismantled just to fit in with whoever holds power in the room.
It's so easy to do.
It is remarkably easy to hold egalitarian, grace-based beliefs when you are sitting in a safe space. It is entirely different when the cultural elites or the judgment of your specific in-group threatens your social standing.
Because Peter's hypocrisy wasn't born out of a sudden change in his theological beliefs. It was born entirely of fear.
Just fear.
Paul specifically notes that Peter feared those of the circumcision. Fear of losing status will always compel us to rebuild walls of division.
Which poses a deeply uncomfortable question for all of us. Are you acting like Peter in any area of your life? Do your stated beliefs, your actions, or the people you are willing to be seen with change depending on which group is watching you?
That hits close to home.
Are you compromising your core convictions and marginalizing others simply to avoid the disapproval of an elite crowd?
That is a profound diagnostic for our own integrity. Because if we alter our behavior to appease a legalistic group, we are, as Paul points out, making ourselves transgressors of the very grace we claim to rely on.
Having established that even the great Peter was dead wrong to return to the law, Paul turns his rhetorical crosshairs back to the Galatians. He essentially asks them, if it was foolish for Peter to rebuild those walls, why are you actively doing the exact same thing?
He doesn't let them off the hook.
No, he doesn't.
Paul deploys some of his most brilliant and, frankly, aggressive theological arguments here. He begins with a question that just drips with frustration. He says, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you?"
Bewitched, like they're under a spell.
Exactly. He frames their defection not just as a poor choice, but as if they have been put under a spell by the Judaizers. And to break this spell, Paul uses a masterful historical counterargument.
How does he do that?
Well, the Judaizers were obsessed with the law of Moses. They treated it as the ultimate eternal standard of righteousness. So Paul bypasses Moses entirely and points them all the way back to Abraham, the founding patriarch of the faith.
I am fascinated by this strategic jump in the text. He goes straight over the head of Moses. How does an ancient patriarch fit into an argument about a new gospel of grace? I mean, Moses is the law guy.
It is an argument of timeline and precedent. Paul reminds them that Abraham lived over 4 centuries before the law of Moses was even given at Mount Sinai.
400 years before the law.
Right. Yet the scriptures say Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. How was Abraham justified? Purely by faith.
He just believed.
Yes. He trusted the promise of God before a single dietary law or 10 commandment even existed.
That is a devastating theological mic drop.
It really is.
He is telling the legalists, your beloved system isn't even the original system. The mechanism of justification has always been faith. But, okay, that raises a massive logical problem. If the law wasn't meant to save us, and faith was always the mechanism, what was the point of the law? Why did God give all those rules to Moses in the first place?
It's the natural next question, and Paul anticipates it perfectly. The core wisdom here is understanding the temporary utilitarian purpose of the law. To explain this, Paul uses a very specific cultural term. In the Greek text, he calls the law a pedagogos.
Pedagogos. A lot of English translations render that as schoolmaster or tutor, which, I gotta say, makes me think of a gentle, tweed-wearing professor helping a kid with algebra.
Right, it sounds very cozy.
Yeah.
But that translation softens the reality of the ancient world considerably.
Okay, what was it really like?
In Greco-Roman culture, a pedagogos was typically a trusted, often harsh slave whose duty was to supervise the master's child.
A slave.
Yes. And they were not the primary educators. Their job was strictly disciplinary and protective.
Oh, wow.
They enforced curfews, they demanded strict behavior, they actually carried sticks to punish infractions. Their primary duty was to march the child safely through the dangerous streets to the actual school.
So they were boundary-enforcing guardians.
Exactly.
They were the ones slapping the ruler on the desk demanding compliance, like, stay in line, don't touch that, walk straight.
Exactly the function of the law. The law was given to reveal human sin, to restrain evil through strict boundaries, and to show humanity its absolute inability to achieve perfection.
Because no one could keep all the rules.
Right. And by doing that, it pointed them toward their need for a savior. It kept humanity in protective custody until faith in Christ arrives.
I picture it like scaffolding on a massive construction site.
Oh, that's a good visual.
Yeah, you absolutely need scaffolding to build a building. It provides rigid structure, boundaries, and protection while the construction is happening. But once the building is complete, once faith has come, if you insist on leaving the scaffolding up forever, you are actually obscuring the architecture.
You can't even see the building.
Right. You are missing the entire point of the building. The scaffolding was never meant to be a permanent residence.
The scaffolding analogy perfectly captures Paul's exasperation here, because once the child comes of age, once faith has arrived, you don't need the pedagogos marching you to school with a stick anymore. You are a full-grown heir.
You're an adult.
Exactly. To willingly place yourself back under the law is like an adult CEO demanding that their childhood nanny come back to the office to tell them what time they have to eat lunch and when to take a nap.
That would be absurd.
It is a pathetic regression.
The fascinating thing is that this specific tension, the struggle between clinging to rigid rules and stepping into enlightened freedom, is not unique to Paul. We see this human tendency addressed in other wisdom traditions as well.
We do.
If you look at Buddhism, for instance, there is the famous parable of the raft. The strict teachings and precepts are compared to a sturdy raft built to cross a violent, dangerous river.
A necessary tool.
Right. But the Buddha teaches that once a person reaches the other shore, the shore of enlightenment or true freedom, they don't pick up the heavy, waterlogged wooden raft and carry it around on their back for the rest of their journey.
That would be exhausting.
The raft served its purpose. Put it down. Paul is saying the exact same thing about the law. It was the raft. You've crossed the river through Christ. Leave the raft on the shore.
But people tend to idolize the vehicle that brought them to the destination, mistaking the vehicle for the destination itself. The Judaizers had idolized the raft.
Wow. Yes.
But Paul pushes the implications of this freedom even further. Once you step off the raft and into the reality of grace, all the superficial, humanly constructed divisions used to determine status are completely obliterated.
It levels everything.
This culminates in Galatians 3.28, which is arguably one of the most revolutionary statements ever written in the ancient world.
What does it say?
He writes, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus."
We read that today and might just nod along because we are steeped in modern democratic ideals. But we have to realize how earth-shattering that sounded in the first century.
It was scandalous.
The Roman Empire was built on a hyper-stratified, status-obsessed hierarchy. You had the patron-client system, citizens versus non-citizens, free men versus slaves. To publicly declare that a slave and a Roman citizen, a man and woman, a Jew and a Gentile, were on completely equal spiritual footing, that was a radical dismantling of the entire social order.
It removed every ladder humans used to climb over one another. And translating this to our 21st century reality, this single verse is a devastating challenge to our modern tribalism.
Oh, man. Yes, it is.
Whether it is identity politics, class warfare, educational snobbery, or intense political polarization, human beings love to segment themselves into subgroups to prove moral or intellectual superiority.
We cling to our labels so tightly.
We do. But this text insists on radical equality based on our shared inability to save ourselves and our shared reliance on grace.
If we are all standing on the exact same level ground at the foot of grace, there is zero room for tribal boasting. It demands profound humility, which leads to a vital practice for our listeners. Take a moment to identify one tribal label you secretly use to elevate yourself above others. It might be your political affiliation, your zip code, the university you attended, your tax bracket, or even your specific brand of religious purity.
We all have one.
We do. How does the concept of radical equalizing grace dismantle that label? If you truly absorb the reality of Galatians 3.28, how would it fundamentally change the way you interact with someone on the other side of your favorite label tomorrow?
Because it strips away all our artificial leverage. Paul continues to build on this idea of our elevated, equalized status by shifting his metaphors. He moves from the legal, disciplinary metaphor of the tutor to the deeply personal, intimate metaphor of a family.
Okay, so a shift in tone.
Yes. He wants to show the Galatians the tragic irony of choosing the status of a slave when they have already been granted the status of an adopted heir.
The core wisdom Paul drops here is that believers are no longer underage children or slaves. They possess the spirit that allows them to cry out, Abba, Father.
And the historical context of Roman inheritance law is the key that unlocks this imagery.
How so?
Well, under Roman law, a child who was the designated heir to a vast estate was, in practical terms, virtually indistinguishable from a slave as long as they were a minor.
Wait, really? Even if they were going to own everything?
Yes. They had no access to the wealth, they could make no legal decisions, and they were under the strict control of guardians, tutors, and estate stewards. They had to obey orders, just like the servants.
That must have been frustrating.
But at the fullness of time, a specific date, determined by the father, they would undergo a ceremony. They would shed the garments of a minor, put on the toga virilis, which is the toga of an adult, and officially inherit the estate.
So in a single day, they transition from being managed like a servant to being the master of the house.
Exactly. And the mechanism of adoption in the Roman world was legally ironclad. So Paul is looking at humanity and saying, before Christ, we were like that underage child. We were restricted, managed by the basic elements of the world, kept under the strict supervision of the law.
But the fullness of time has come.
Yes. God sent his Son to redeem us, and we have gone through the ceremony. We have received full adoption. We hold the estate.
And he used this incredibly intimate Aramaic word, Abba. It translates closely to Papa or Daddy. It denotes a relationship of absolute familial security, entirely devoid of fear.
The contrast is staggering, isn't it? The Galatians possess the intimacy of Abba, Father, yet they are demanding to return to what Paul describes as the weak and beggarly elements.
They want to go back to the oppressive, fear-based rights of the law.
Right.
We return to the psychology of regression. Why do we go back? Think of our fast food billionaire from the start of the deep dive.
Right, the guy at the fry machine.
Exactly. Why would someone who just inherited a $50 million estate wake up the next morning and go work the fry machine for minimum wage? They do it because they don't know how to handle the terrifying freedom of unearned wealth.
It's too much for them.
The freedom is too vast. It requires a completely new identity. So they retreat to the familiar, predictable misery of punching a clock, because at least there they know exactly what the rules are and what they are worth per hour. We are terrified of grace because we didn't earn it, which means we can't control it.
Wow. We default to a wage earner mentality. And to illustrate this tragic choice, Paul deploys an allegory that honestly presents a significant obstacle for modern readers.
Let's get into this because it's a tough section.
It is. He reaches back into the book of Genesis and uses the story of Abraham's two sons, Ishmael, who was born to the slave woman Hagar, and Isaac, who was born to the free woman Sarah.
This is a section where we really need some wisdom with discernment because modern listeners hit this text and immediately bristle.
Oh, for sure.
Paul talks about the bondwoman and the free woman, and he quotes the Old Testament saying, "Cast out the bondwoman and her son." In our modern context, the casual use of slavery as a theological metaphor, or the seemingly harsh endorsement of casting out a vulnerable, exploited woman like Hagar, feels deeply problematic.
It sounds incredibly harsh today.
It can sound culturally insensitive or like an endorsement of historical cruelty. I mean, I gotta ask, the slavery metaphor is yikes for us today.
It requires very careful handling, and the researchers provide essential guardrails here. It's emphasized that Paul is explicitly stating he is using this narrative strictly as an allegory.
Okay, meaning what?
meaning he is not writing a commentary validating the institution of human slavery. He is certainly not endorsing Sarah's historical mistreatment of Hagar, which was originally driven by human jealousy and a lack of faith in God's promise.
So he's not saying Sarah was right to be mean.
Not at all. Paul is simply taking a culturally well-known historical narrative and overlaying a spiritual meaning onto it to contrast two completely incompatible operating systems.
Okay, I need to understand the mechanism of the allegory. How does Paul map these two systems onto the story?
In Paul's allegorical reading, Hagar, the slave woman, represents the covenant made at Mount Sinai, the law. The children of Sinai are born into bondage, constantly trying to earn their status through rule-keeping.
Okay, that's one system.
Right. Sarah, the free woman, represents the new covenant of grace. Her child, Isaac, was born miraculously out of a promise from God, entirely independent of human effort.
Because they were too old to have kids naturally.
Exactly. So when Paul reaches his controversial conclusion, cast out the bondwoman, he is not issuing a literal command to abuse or exile people.
Oh, I see.
He is issuing a radical, internal, spiritual command. You must ruthlessly expel the system of legalism from your own mind.
You cannot live simultaneously by the freedom of unearned grace and the slavery of a performance checklist.
Right. They cannot coexist in the same psychological house. One will always attempt to dominate the other.
The wage earner mindset must be evicted so the heir can actually live.
Precisely.
Reframing it as evicting an operating system completely changes the tone of the text. It brings us to a powerful reflection point. Are you suffering from spiritual imposter syndrome?
A lot of people do.
Examine how you relate to the universe or to God. Do you operate like a fearful employee trying to earn your daily wages, constantly terrified you are going to get fired if your performance drops? Or do you relate to God as a completely secure child, able to rest in the intimacy of Abba, Father, knowing your inheritance is locked in?
Living as a fearful employee means you haven't fully grasped the mechanism of the gospel.
Right.
But, the moment you start preaching this kind of absolute unearned freedom, you inevitably run into a major objection. And Paul anticipates his critics perfectly.
The immediate pushback to grace is always the fear of moral anarchy.
Always.
The critics look at Paul and say, wait a minute, if the law is evicted, if there are no checklists, and we are just permanently secure heirs, what stops people from doing whatever they want? If I have no rules, I'm just going to eat cake all day and do whatever I want.
Right. They assume people will just sin with absolute abandon.
Paul knows this accusation is coming, so he provides a comprehensive framework for what true freedom actually looks like in practice.
And the core wisdom here really redefines liberty for the modern age. True freedom is not a license to indulge our most selfish desires. It is the empowerment to serve others in love.
Which is a twist.
It is. Paul writes, "You are called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love, serve one another."
That requires a massive translation for our modern context. The prevailing Western 21st century definition of freedom is essentially absolute autonomy.
Nobody tells me what to do.
Exactly. We define freedom as nobody can tell me what to do, and I have the right to fulfill any urge or desire I have without external consequence.
But Paul turns that definition upside down.
He does. He argues that if you simply follow every base instinct, appetite, and impulse you have, you aren't actually free. You are a slave to your own biology and ego. True freedom is the capacity to not be enslaved by your own toxic desires.
To explain how this capacity works, Paul introduces the internal war between the flesh and the spirit. And we need to clarify his terms here.
Yeah, let's define flesh.
When Paul uses the word flesh, he is not talking about the physical human body, as if the material world is evil. The physical body is a neutral vessel. By flesh, he means the corrupt, self-centered human operating system, the primal ego that prioritizes the self at the expense of everyone else.
And he provides a diagnostic list of what the works of the flesh look like. It's a grim catalog of human misery. Adultery, impurity, idolatry, hostility, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness.
Our commentaries make a brilliant observation here. They note that these aren't just abstract sins against God. They are fundamentally social sins against our neighbors.
It's all about how we treat people.
Exactly. When the ego of the flesh rules, society immediately breaks down into biting and devouring one another.
In stark contrast to the destruction of the flesh, Paul lists the fruit of the Spirit. If a person is animated and led by the divine Spirit, the external output looks radically different.
Completely different.
It's love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And you have to pay close attention to the metaphor of fruit here. Works of the flesh are manufactured by human striving, anxiety, and ego.
But fruit is grown organically simply by remaining connected to the source of life.
Right. You don't see a branch straining and sweating to produce an apple. It produces the apple naturally because of the sap flowing through it.
That's a beautiful image.
I understand the organic growth concept, but I want to push back on some of the language Paul uses regarding how we handle the flesh. It sounds extreme.
In what way?
Well, in Galatians 5:24, he says, "And those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires." Crucifixion is a horrifically violent, painful image. That sounds incredibly violent. Is Paul slipping into asceticism here? Is he saying we should hate ourselves, punish our bodies, or practice self-harm to achieve holiness?
It is a violent metaphor, but the historical context provides the necessary guardrails to prevent it from becoming abusive asceticism. Crucifixion in the ancient world wasn't just execution. It was a method of slow, agonizing starvation of life.
So it wasn't instant.
No. When Paul says to crucify the flesh, he means to actively, intentionally, and continuously starve out those toxic, destructive passions. You don't negotiate with your ego. You don't feed your jealousy or your rage.
You just stop feeding it.
You nail them to the cross and refuse to let them dictate your actions, knowing they will slowly lose their power over time. It is the painful process of saying no to the ego so that the spirit can say yes to love.
Okay, when you describe mastering the lower appetites to achieve peace, my mind immediately jumps to Stoicism.
Oh, interesting connection.
Yeah, the great Stoic philosophers Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus, they wrote extensively about controlling the passions, refusing to let anger rule you, and elevating reason over impulse. It sounds remarkably similar to crucifying the flesh.
The external ethical outcomes might look similar, a calm, self-controlled individual. But the internal mechanism is entirely different. This distinction is paramount.
How so?
Stoicism relies on rigorous human willpower, discipline, and rational detachment. It is an internal project where you conquer yourself.
Right.
But Paul's Christian framework insists that you cannot overcome the flesh by relying on the flesh's own willpower. That is a closed loop that eventually fails.
So what's the alternative?
The victory is achieved by walking by the Spirit, yielding to a higher divine power outside yourself.
Oh, I see. Think of it like sailing a ship.
Okay.
Stoicism is like learning to row a massive galley perfectly. It requires intense human intellect, ruling discipline, and endless physical exertion. You might make progress, but eventually your arms give out.
You get exhausted.
Walking by the Spirit is like raising a sail and catching a powerful wind. You do not generate the wind. You do not control the wind. But by yielding to it, the wind powers the boat across the water in a way your own rowing never could.
That is the perfect distinction. It is about surrender, not striving.
Let's make this intensely practical for the listener. Review that list of the fruit of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Pick one that you actively struggle with right now.
For a lot of us, it's patience.
Let's say it's patience. The typical modern approach is to try and force yourself to be patient this week through sheer willpower, which usually just leads to repressed anger.
Oh, definitely.
Instead of rowing harder, how can you raise the sail? How can you yield to a more spiritual mindset? How can you step back, breathe, remember your profound security as an accepted heir, and let that patience grow naturally as a byproduct of your peace rather than a metric of your performance?
Because when your identity is utterly secure, you no longer have to fiercely defend your ego. Patience and gentleness become the natural overflow.
Exactly.
And this internal personal transformation is designed to spill over into how we treat each other in community, which Paul addresses in his final chapter.
Internal freedom is great, but life involves dealing with messy, complicated human beings. How does this ecosystem of grace operate practically when people inevitably fail?
The core wisdom of the final chapter is a beautiful balance of communal responsibility and profound humility. We are responsible for caring for one another's failures, while simultaneously respecting the unbending law of natural consequences.
Which Paul phrases as whatsoever a man sows, that shall he also reap.
Exactly. Let's start with how we handle the failures of others. Galatians 6:1 says, "Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted." Okay,
I was looking at the commentary on this verse, and it points out a fascinating detail about the Greek word used for restore. The word is katertizet.
It is a profound choice of words. Katertizet is a medical term used in the ancient world for setting a dislocated bone back into joint, or a nautical term for mending torn fishing nets.
Setting a dislocated bone is such a vivid, tactile image. If you have ever had a dislocated shoulder, you know that setting it is incredibly painful. But the intent behind the pain is healing and structural integrity, not punishment.
Right.
If we contrast this ancient wisdom with our modern cancel culture, the difference is blinding.
It's the exact opposite.
In cancel culture, on social media, or wherever, if someone is caught in a moral failure, the immediate goal is amputation.
You cut them off.
You cut them off, destroy their livelihood, burn their reputation, and exile them from the community to signal your own moral purity. But the community of grace is called to a much harder task: setting the dislocated bone.
And setting the bone requires getting close to the injury. You don't ignore the brokenness, you confront the sin directly, but you do it with a spirit of gentleness.
Because you could break it worse if you're not gentle.
Exactly. And the key to that gentleness is the warning Paul adds. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. The person setting the bone must do so with the terrifying awareness that they are entirely capable of making the exact same moral catastrophic failure.
That terrifying self-awareness is the ultimate antidote to self-righteousness.
It really is.
But as we navigate this community care, there is a verse that trips people up. It requires some wisdom with discernment to untangle. In verse 2, Paul commands, "Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ." But literally 3 verses later in verse 5, he writes, "For each will have to bear his own load."
That sounds like a flat contradiction, doesn't it?
It totally does. Help me carry my stuff, but also carry your own stuff.
The commentaries resolve this brilliantly by looking at the specific Greek words used for the types of burdens being discussed.
That was the difference.
When Paul says bear one another's burdens in verse 2, the word denotes a crushing, overwhelming weight, a boulder. He is talking about deep grief, severe temptation, sudden tragedy, or systemic oppression.
Things you physically cannot lift alone.
Exactly. These are weights that no human being can lift alone. We are commanded to step in, put our shoulders under the boulder, and lift it together.
But what about verse 5?
In verse 5, each will bear his own load. The word used refers to a soldier's standard issue backpack or a ship's cargo. He is talking about ultimate personal accountability and moral responsibility before God.
Oh, I see the distinction. It is vital.
It is. We are called to help others carry their crushing grief, but we absolutely cannot outsource our own moral responsibility. You cannot ask someone else to carry your integrity.
I can help you pay a medical bill if you are crushed by debt, but I cannot do your push-ups for you, and I cannot apologize to your spouse for you. You have to carry your own backpack.
Beautifully put.
And this concept of ultimate accountability leads directly to a major obstacle for modern listeners. We love the idea of grace, but we frequently distort it. We want grace to mean a magical get-out-of-jail-free card that erases all earthly consequences.
We want to skip the hard part.
We want to act terribly, yell grace, and have the universe instantly fix the mess. But Paul introduces a stern, unyielding principle of spiritual physics. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked, for whatever one sows, that will he also reap.
Because grace forgives the sinner, but grace does not cancel the harvest of the seeds you planted. Every action has a reaction.
If you plant corn, you get corn. You do not get tomatoes.
Right. If you sow to your own flesh, if you spend your life planting seeds of selfishness, deceit, ego, and unchecked anger, you will reap a harvest of relational and spiritual corruption.
There's no escaping that.
There isn't. If you spend 20 years alienating your children through explosive anger, God's grace may forgive your soul, but you still have to do the grueling, painful work of rebuilding those broken relationships. The universe has a moral fabric, and God is not mocked.
But Paul flips that intimidating law of the harvest into a massive encouragement. He applies it to doing good. Let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up.
It's a great promise.
Which gives us our final reflection for the listener in this section. Are you growing weary in doing good? It is so incredibly easy to get exhausted when you are continually planting good seeds.
It's so easy.
Showing up for people, operating with quiet integrity, choosing patience instead of rage, serving without applause, and you don't see any immediate results. The harvest of the Spirit is not a microwave process. It takes time.
It takes a lot of time.
Take an inventory of your life today. What specific seeds are you sowing with your time, your money, and your attention? And if you keep planting those exact same seeds, what kind of harvest will you be standing in 10 years from now? Trust the spiritual physics. Don't give up on the good seeds.
The ecosystem of grace requires a long obedience in the same direction.
And that brings us to the very end of this incredible fiery document. As Paul signs off, he takes the pen from his scribe and writes the final lines with his own hand. And he leaves the Galatians with a final provocative thought.
It's such a striking ending.
Throughout this entire letter, the Judaizers had been pressuring the Galatians to take on a physical mark circumcision so they would look respectable to the surrounding religious society. It was a badge of approval designed to help them avoid persecution and fit in. But Paul ends the letter by saying in chapter 6, verse 17, "I bear on my body the marks of Jesus."
He is referring to the literal physical scars he received from being whipped, beaten, and stoned for refusing to compromise the gospel of grace.
Wow.
He didn't carry the neat, socially acceptable badges of societal approval. He carried the brutal scars of authentic, unyielding conviction.
And that is the question we want to leave you with today, to mull over as you step back into your life. What marks are you willing to carry for your deepest convictions? Are you spending your energy constantly chasing the badges of societal approval, constantly shifting your beliefs to fit whatever room you happen to be standing in? Or are you willing to bear the scars of authentic living, standing firm in the freedom and grace that you've been given, even when it costs you your status? In the end, it forces us to choose our identity. Are we slaves to the crowd's approval, or are we secure heirs of grace?
That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.